Hello fellas! In this video we're going to assemble, detail, paint and do the weathering on the engines and propellers of our 1/48 scale Douglas Invader build. Let's go! This kit provides a very nicely detailed engine right out of the box. First, let's assemble the cylinder rows. Here I am not concerned about the seam between the two parts, because it will be hidden inside the cowl anyways. After drilling a spark plug hole in each cylinder and a layer of surface primer, I decided to apply dark aluminum metallizer from AK. This is probably my favorite paint range as far as metallizers go, as they have excellent metallic effect, but also the cured paint is quite tough and wear resistant for a metallizer. To make the cooling grips a little bit more prominent, I used Tamiya's dark grey panel line accent color. And if you consider this as a weathering, this will be it for this part of the engine. So let's move along. Next we are going to focus on the reductor case and all the components attached to it, like the ignition distributors, the magneto and the ignition ring. Since this will be the most visible part of the engine, I am going to put my efforts here. After removing the molded-in ignition wire connectors from the ignition ring, I made a jig out of scrap plastic, which will help me to cut equal lengths of microtubes, and those I will use to create the new connectors. I superglued a pair of tubes in front of each cylinder, gluing the tubes for the rear row at a bit of an angle. This, along with the holes in the cylinders, will make the installation of the ignition wires much easier task. To spice up the distributors, I drilled holes where their bolts are supposed to be. Then I inserted a section of stretch sprue in each hole, gluing it down with liquid cement. After the glue was cured, I trimmed the excess sprue away, and the remainder should represent a bolt head. Since the case and the distributor will have the same color, I glued them together. Another small detail I added were a couple of wires running from the distributors to the ignition ring, one on each distributor. To paint this detail, I chose to mix my own color using medium sea gray and Thunderbird's blue. Of course, before the paint, I applied surface primer. The ignition ring I chose to paint in black, and since I did not want to go through the trouble of masking, I used a fine tip brush and some care to do the job. After the base coat was dry, I applied highlights using a dark grey acrylic paint, essentially retracing the natural highlights created by my studio lights. Next, I painted the end portion of the ignition wire tubes with silver paint. I have seen this on some reference images, besides it does not hurt to have some more colors. The final detail painting task on this part was to pick out each individual bolt head with a light bluish grey acrylic paint. This may seem as a boring task, but it requires so much focus that I barely noticed the time passed while I was painting them bolt heads. Once again, Tamiya's dark grey accent color will take care of the shadows around the details. This time I applied it more liberally, so it can achieve some more of a weathering effect. One interesting thing about this product is that it seems like it does flow equally nice on gloss as well as matte surface. Next I applied a few dots of Starship Field oil paint, and then using a flat brush, kind of destroyed on that, I smeared the dots so it looks like residue left from touching the surface with greasy fingers and then smearing that with further handling. Not too obvious as an effect, but I think it does give the feel of an operational piece of equipment. Here on the propellers, I decided to trade some accuracy and realism in favor of a little bit of drama. So after a layer of gloss black paint, I applied Tamiya's LP11 silver. After the silver had enough time to cure, I applied liquid mask on the leading edge of each blade using a sponge. While painting the silver, I was careful not to paint over the propeller mechanism dome, because I wanted to cover it with some AK polished aluminum, and to get a nice reflective metal we need gloss black base. After the dome got some time to cure, I masked it off and loaded the airbrush with flat black paint. While waiting for a set of silicone brushes to arrive, I removed the mask using a Q-tip soaked in the same masking liquid, which works quite nicely, but at the end both the masking liquid and the Q-tip get bent, so not a very sensible approach. The next step is to apply the decals on the propeller blades. Here I am using Mr. Mark softener to both set and conform the decals to the surface, which is the only way this product works for me, unfortunately. With that out of the way, it is time for a quick layer of flat varnish. After masking off the majority of the blades, I painted the tips in yellow color. It takes a few passes to cover over the black base, but it's not bad at all. On the propeller hub, I chose to apply Tamiya's LP38 flat aluminum. This will give us a nice contrast with the polished aluminum on the dome. As I said earlier, the accent colors from Tamiya flow very well over all surfaces, and this dark grey works pretty well with the bare metal finish. Using a light grey watercolor pencil, I created many non-metallic chips on the propeller blades. All those cuffs and nicks are presumably caused by the blades hitting an object or a not very careful mechanic. May look a bit overdone, but remember, we traded some accuracy for a bit of drama. I also removed some of the yellow paint on the tips to reveal the silver paint underneath, and also did some sponge chipping using dark grey paint. To make the demarcation between the propeller hub and the dome, I applied Starship Field oil paint on the downside, and then carefully blended it forwards so it forms a gradient and gently disappears. And with that the propellers are done. Among the fiddly bits, without a doubt the most annoying was the drilling of the exhaust stacks. It is not a difficult task, but there are so many that it was one very boring bench session. After painting them in grey base coat, I applied a brown color over the stacks, trying to get a somewhat transparent coat so that the grey can still have some presence. Then using a mixture of clear varnish and black paint, I simulated the soot that collects at the exhaust tips. Then I covered everything with a layer of flat varnish, because neither the heat oxidation nor the soot are glossy in appearance. Another thing that I did was to apply silver paint on the tips of the push rods. And then similarly to the ignition ring, I created some highlights with dark grey acrylic paint. Another place where I applied flat aluminum were the intake manifolds. I have the strong suspicion that they will not be visible at all, but still they can look good before I assemble the model. The final little piece of the puzzle was the magneto, which was painted in flat black first and then received a quick dry brushing using buff oil paint. This is an extremely efficient method of highlighting edges in my opinion. At last we can assemble all the pieces of those engines together. I have to say that the engineering of the kit in this area is pretty good. The tolerances however are pretty small and some force is required even without paint being applied on the mating surfaces. It gets a bit hairy when you have delicate details and you have to press fit the parts together. For this reason, stacking several parts on top of each other results in small gaps that finally don't allow the final piece to reach all the way, as was the case with the intake manifolds. So in order to display the engine, a lot of careful cleanup has to be done to avoid these issues. which is part of the reason why I decided to keep the engines in the cowlings. Having the holes in the cylinders and the tubes on the ignition ring helped me a lot with the installation of the ignition wires. For those of you who haven't wired a double Wasp, there are a lot of ignition wires. 2 for each cylinder and there are 18 cylinders. And in this case we have 2 engines, which tallies up to 72 ignition wires, so any help is highly appreciated. Regardless of the amount of work involved, this is an extremely important addition, as this is the area where the engine is visible, and that's why I'm focusing the detailing here. On the bottom of the reductor casing we have a couple of what I believe are oil feed lines. I made those out of 0.3mm soldering wire. Along with those I will add a small wire running from the magneto towards the ignition ring. In between the 2 oil feed lines I installed a hoop that connects all of the front row cylinders. And then I glued the second oil line to the case and then on the hoop for added strength. The presence of a jig for the exhaust stack installation is a blessing. My only criticism is that the jig will not stay in position on its own, kind of the opposite of all the other details in the engine assembly. Here the instructions should be followed carefully because not all of the stacks are the same. Gluing them can be a bit of a struggle if you don't prepare in advance. The pegs on the exhaust will not go into the corresponding holes of the cylinders unless the hole gets enlarged or the pegs cleaned up. I did not anticipate this and I had to press the stack with some liquid cement in the joint so that the melting action can allow for a proper connection. In the next episode we are going to gather all the subassemblies and fuse them into an aircraft model. In fact, you can follow the progress and see what is already done on my Patreon page. There I post almost daily updates with a lot of pictures and ad-free videos. For this and more interesting content visit the link in the description. Thank you for watching and until next time, happy modeling fellas!